from Oakland, California. This is Revolution. And today on the show, our guest today is a counselor, drug counselor that's definitely worked with the Unhoused community. And it was a very in-depth, deep dive conversation about not just the inner workings of that industry, because often when I have people that come on from that world, we take some deep dives, and generally it's people that have smaller agencies, or people like me that have written their whistleblower essays and published them that will tell all. This young lady still is in the industry, so she was not in a tell-all. Like, she told all, but couldn't go by a real name. So throughout the interview, if you hear me call her random names, like, she who shall not be named, or I think at one point we just went by Akira. Off air, we had a long conversation about Robotech, our mutual admiration for the 80s children's cartoon. That being said, this was a very interesting conversation. It takes a deep dive into some things that I don't think really get examined, or as my live stream co-host Pascal Robert says, interrogated. But when we say defund the police, and again, I'm a proponent of definitely taking the funds that we use to overpay law enforcement and do something with them that is actually advantageous to the community. And there was kind of a theme with the way she sees even the defund the police movement. And her big thing is, if you're not changing the fundamental conditions for people, then you're literally just trying to burn out these counselors and therapists that you want to get to handle some of these problems that we're complaining that police shouldn't be handling because they're literally not equipped. And one of the things that she brings up is, what are you going to do? Like, for example, we talk about it on this show where I live in the Bay Area. There's talk of removing the police for our subway system, rapid transit system. It's called BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, and replacing it with like counselors. And, she had a good point about that. At some point, these counselors just become another arm of law enforcement. My point is, who regulates them, who hires them, what qualifications are they really going to have? We get into it in this conversation. In this industry, you're not generally paying for top-notch work. So you burn people out a lot. So it's not like counselors are known to get the same overtime that police officers get. So if we really want to try to combat this problem, it's bigger than slogans, of course, right? So we get into it in this conversation. It was a 2-hour conversation. So the first hour is everywhere. It's for you guys to hear. But the second hour is for patrons only. So anywhere you are listening to this show, there is a link in the description to become a patron. It's easy. We put some new incentives in there, like This is Revolution sweatshirts and t-shirts and mugs and stuff. So we got all kinds of goodies in there now for people that want to become patrons. We're adding more and more patron-only content because the community is actually getting larger. So we have to actually do more for that community. Also, wherever you're listening to the show is a link in the description to the YouTube channel, the Twitter, and the Facebook. We do a live stream every Tuesday, Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And these live streams have been getting more and more interesting. We have one up now. We did a review of the Judas and the Black Messiah movie, Pascal and I, and we had another deep dive into China, deep dive into Haiti, contemporary Haitian politics, contemporary Russian and Eastern Europe politics. So tune in to the live stream. You can become part of it. Sometimes, if you've been listening to the podcast, sometimes I take the live stream and I dump the audio down to the audio only podcast if they're really, really good. I think I'm going to dump a few of these down there because they're really good. And I know there's a little bit of non-crossover still with these audiences. But please sign up, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, every Wednesday, we have a new episode that goes live on Zero Books YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Zero Books. I'll also have a link in the description for that as well. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this and enjoy this episode with the one who shall not be named. All right. All the way live from the town. This is Revolution. And this is something I don't get to do too much anymore, I feel like, which is have a one-on-one conversation with someone about something they do that I find extremely interesting. So this person that we're talking to today is going to go by the name Akira. One of the first anime, I think it might have been the first anime movies I've seen, like full-length film that was anime. I think Akira might have been that one. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I swear Akira was like the first one I saw. Became friends with our guests via social media. We have so many mutuals, it's ridiculous. And we often get into conversations via social media about, I don't want to say drug policy, but I think we've gotten to a few drug policy conversations, but definitely conversations about something that's very near and dear to me, which is the unhoused. And how the unhoused are treated. And one thing that definitely grabbed my attention was whenever there's an article about like a police force that's been forced to shift money around. I hate saying defunded because more often than not it's a lot of shifting money around. To have some sort of counselor do something where law enforcement, armed law enforcement usually came in. Our guest today, Akira, usually had sometimes that's not always the best thing to do, especially when these departments tend to be underfunded. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest today, Akira.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you for taking some time to talk to me. this fine evening. This will come out in the morning. What day, I don't know off the top of my head. I have to look at my calendars, my release schedule calendar, but I haven't done one of these in the evening in a long time, and it's actually kind of fun to have these talks in the evening. It's a different kind of vibe. So you are a drug counselor by trade.
Yes.
What makes one get into drug counseling? When you are a little girl, do you sit around and say, you know what, one day I'm going to talk people off that ledge for a living?
You know, I think for me, I'm one of the exceptions oftentimes in this industry, because compulsive substance use has not been a personal history, but it has been something that has impacted me through family and through friends. And this was actually not a field that I necessarily wanted to get into, not because of anything, but as a teenager and as a young adult, it was it was in my environment all the time through friends. And I had a lot of conflicts with how people were treated, whether it was in rehab or whether it was through very inappropriate sponsorships through the 12-step programs, or, there's so much misconception, I think, about like mental health and drug use in general.
What do you think's the biggest misconception?
Right. So I think the biggest misconception is that I think, there's this concept that drugs are what gets you addicted to drugs. And I'm not going to say that that doesn't happen, obviously, but it's also there's many, many life circumstances. There's, huge factors in the environment, in trauma, in so many factors that play into that fixating on substances, and how we've dealt with substances in the United States is through supply controls, right? So criminalizing drugs and selling of drugs. And that has had, the war on drugs has, decimated communities, has decimated people's lives in, really fundamentally unproductive ways. And kind of seeing that trajectory, it was not something that, because I spent so much of my personal life with friends kind of navigating that it wasn't something that really occurred to me. It was something that ended up kind of being encouraged. I was looking for a career change. I had my own business that was completely, totally unrelated for a long time. And I was getting burned out, and I was thinking about a career change. And that was when I had some former friends that were like, oh, you helped me so much when, I was having issues. I think you really should get into the field. And, I've always enjoyed working with people. That was something that a lot of people told me that I was good at. So I decided to give it a shot. And it's also something that has been a lifelong interest, because I've always had a lifelong interest in public health. And I always saw it as a public health problem, not a criminal justice issue.
Now, drugs as a criminal justice issue is forever the hot button topic, right? Legalize, don't legalize, what we legalize, how we punish. And you talk about the war on drugs. That punishment definitely gets ramped up in the mid 80s as crack becomes more and more prevalent in inner cities and poor communities. And then definitely by the time the 94 crime bill rolls around, we're building prisons more so as overflow facilities to handle the disgusting amount of people that were locked up in the 80s. Because, if anybody remembers, that was the talk, was like the overflow of prisons. And even people like Joe Biden got pushback when he was trying to do some of these draconian laws in the early 80s. Like, hey, man, you're going to fill the prisons if you if you do this bullshit. Working in drug counseling, do you feel sometimes that it's a constant revolving door? Like the system itself makes the door revolve?
Well, it's one of those things where, like, fundamentally what it comes down to it is that we have a society that doesn't want to invest in people's well-being. Mm. You see that literally in our federal budgets, right? Like, we spend more money on the military and bombing people.
Yeah.
Than, feeding people, housing people, making sure they have health care, making sure they have mental health care. The fact that, medical schools, like, since we're talking about mental health, psychiatry is a MD, right? Medical schools are really expensive, which limits the number of actually talented people that would really serve our society. It prevents them from going into the field. If you're talking about mental health, with psychology, with therapy, even with drug counseling, there's internship requirements that are often unpaid or not paid well if you do end up getting a paid job. That limits the amount of talented people that could really get into this field.
Does it feel like a class issue? Does it feel like, when you say...
It's definitely a class issue in terms of the providers, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the providers, there's a definite class issue. For sure.
So where does that leave, like, unhoused communities and the poor when it comes to us? And this is kind of back to my original point that I made. I don't remember the exact article, and if I was a better host, I'd probably have it up right now. But there was an article that came out of maybe about a month ago that here in the Bay Area, that our subway system called BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit System, was going to start having mental health counselors respond to mental health episodes. Now, those episodes, I would say 9.9 times out of 10 are going to revolve around an unhoused population.
Mm-hmm.
And you had said, you had showed the article. I didn't even see the article. You posted it. And you were like, this, I forget your exact quote, but the message was, this isn't going to work out as well as people think.
Right, because, all these in California, the housing programs are really under an incredible amount of strain. There's, absolutely not enough space, and compared to the need, right? Because fundamentally, with the unhoused, the biggest issue is, when you're talking about the unhoused population as a demographic, you're looking at a combination of often, even if you didn't necessarily have familial or social trauma growing up or as an adult, right? Like, becoming unhoused is traumatic in itself.
Yes.
It's the
fear of it is just is frightening.
Oh, yeah, it's a horrible experience. And, especially in California, like, when we think of the unhoused, right, we think of the tent cities and, people in these tents and sleeping bags under bridges. That's kind of the imagination. But, people living in cars, that's a huge part.
Yes.
Of the unhoused problem in California, and I'm sure everywhere else, right? I mean, just, trying to live out of a car is difficult enough.
Yes.
And then
you make it twice as hard during the pandemic because it's like, where do you shower now?
Mm-hmm.
With all these gyms closed and yeah.
So you're, with the unhoused population, you're dealing with, a lot of people under distress, a lot of people with a lot of physical health issues. I mean, you aren't necessarily able to have a healthy lifestyle when you're unhoused. So you have a population that has a lot of physical health issues. You have a population that has a really high mental health burden. And then you add distress and then, of being unhoused on top of that. And then if you have familial and, social trauma on top of that, that just kind of cascades into, this enormous issue that you're dealing with in a lot of individuals, and
yeah.
And one of the things that, that I think a lot of times we don't necessarily give them a long-term stability in order to set them up for success.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times people kind of and again, being unhoused, one of the major issues is it's really hard to find jobs, right? Nobody wants to hire somebody that's homeless.
Yeah.
Most work requires, more or less that you have an address and all these documentation to get work, right? Your social security card, if you're an immigrant, your green card. I mean, a lot of people lose documentation in the process of being unhoused.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times, and then you add mental health on top of that, you add distress on top of that, you add substance use issue on top of that, you're dealing with somebody that needs a lot of stability to get back to, being able to live a fulfilled, independent life. And that long-term stability can't be just, a few months, 6 months, a year, especially for people who don't necessarily have, skilled trade, labor, work experience, all that to be able to get back up, even, after they conquer some of the mental health, physical health issues to stabilize.
Now, why do you think that's a bad idea, though, for, as we saw this past summer, defund the police was the slogan du jour. And here we have a municipality saying, fine, this is what you want, this is what you get. What do you see as the problem in that?
Well, one of the major issues is if you're just trading out policemen for social workers without properly funding all the social programs,
mm-hmm.
And not just a minor funding, but a major long-term investment in affordable housing, in job training, in even kind of guaranteeing potentially, something like a federal job guarantee, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's really hard to get people stabilized without those kinds of investments. So if it's just a trade in personnel without funding those programs, you're ending up burning out the social workers because the social workers have very little to offer aside from very temporary measures.
That's an interesting take because I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. It's an interesting take because as you see people get very excited about words and phrases from their politicians. So remember in Minneapolis, where kind of the epicenter for these protests were due to the murder of George Floyd. We saw the city council say we're abolishing all police. And last I checked, there's still police in Minneapolis. I know Austin, Texas is taking some money and buying some hotels for the unhoused and providing some sort of permanent supportive housing with job placement. But it's back to, I believe it's truly back to what you said. If you're not looking at permanent solutions and you're just changing personnel and you're not funding these programs to the level that you overfund law enforcement, if these social workers aren't provided the same never-ending overtime that we hear about from law enforcement, then really it sounds like you're trying to shut up these people that are probably going to be doing some backslapping when these things happen, and I wonder how much oversight they're really going to have, because that would be one of the major things I would want to have is oversight over these programs.
Right. I mean, it's social work is already overburdened field. If you look at institutions like the CPS, in San Diego, Los Angeles County, like the caseload is just it's inhumane. It's flat out inhumane. I mean, one of the things about talking to various people, in the United States, in the industry, it's rare. It's exceptionally rare to find a facility that's properly staffed, and properly staffed is kind of dependent on who you're talking to, right? Because all these, infrastructures and institutions would say that they have proper staffing, but, what is proper staffing versus what is humane staffing? What is, staffing based on the actual need that you're facing? If you have one counselor and like 30 clients, and also like, social work is a huge paperwork based.
That it is. And chasing down paperwork for people that don't have a house, like you said, is very hard.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of time you're dealing with a population that's older.
Yeah.
So you're asking people for documents like, hey, I need your proof of benefit. And they're like, dude, I was living in a tent last week. Where do you want me to get that? How do I get that?
Right.
I had a guy in the shelter that was afraid to go to the Social Security office.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it was around the corner. He was just literally frightened to go there. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he had some struggles with literacy. But for your counselor not to know that the person that you're asking to go to the Social Security office has a problem reading, and that might be a problem for them when they're dealing with, I think it was like 40 people. I think everybody had 40 people.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big load to take on. And everyone you're dealing with has, some sort of severe chronic homelessness or mental health issue or chronic physical ailment. That's a hell of a load to take on. You got 40 of these cats, and everybody has a different issue that you have to attend to tenderly.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time. I mean, if you're doing the job well, you have to spend a lot of one-on-one time, which a lot of, facilities don't necessarily give their counselors time, a proper amount of time. Like 40 clients, right? You literally do not have the time to sit down and do one-on-ones.
No. And so you start to look for the people that who can I help?
Mm-hmm.
Who's got their documentation? Who's the easiest to deal with? Who can I help? And do you feel like after a while you get a little jaded by the industry and you start to feel like, well, these are the people that are just going to go back to prison anyway? So, and not you, Akira, but.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where like that's where burnout comes in, right? That's the real cost of burnout in the industry is, you are faced with, such overwhelming need. Like one of the things that happened to me, and my memory has never been that great to start out with, but like when you're hearing so much trauma from people all the time, it kind of starts to all blur together, to the point where like, unless I'm taking, making like, mental notes and like, really having to concentrate and jog my memory. Like, there were times when I've been like sitting in a counseling session where I'm just like, okay, like, were you the client that was like, brutalized by your stepfather, or were you the one that was brutalized by your uncle, or were you the one that was, like, like it all starts to blur together.
Yeah.
And it can sometimes be really hard to like, track each individual situation clearly. And that's where like, taking good notes and having those types of abilities really make a difference in being able to, do your job as a counselor. But, again, like when you're faced with burnout and you don't have the time to really spend time with people, because spending time with people is vital in that it's also about rapport, right? So a lot of times people don't tell you things unless they learn to trust you. You have a population that generally does not trust authority figures.
Which is, again, back to the unhoused population, which is so interesting because you're talking about people that definitely start to see authority figures as just trouble.
Yeah.
And even if you're stepping in and you think you're helping, these cats have seen your ass for the last 25 years. Some of them they're like, I know you're kind. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So it takes a lot of one-on-one time to kind of get over that hurdle. And that's where like a lot of skill comes in, and a lot of these skills are something that's, you can't teach these skills. You have to you practice it individually. It's not something that you develop without experience.
Yeah. I can't imagine a new person coming into the average shelter clinic nowadays and not being overwhelmed, like mentally overwhelmed after like a day or two.
I mean, it's part of, I think, one of the benefits, I think, of like, compulsive substance use not being my own personal experience is that, there are pros and cons to everything, right? But the pros on my end was that because it's not my own experience, I don't necessarily subject people to my experience. And I try to really get to know them individually because it's not my own experience. And I also, like, my learning has been, secondhand through my friends, through family, through talking to people, because I've always, for decades, I've always been the type of person to like strike up random conversations with, the unhoused. And, like I'll talk to them, or if they talk to me, I'll have a conversation with them, and I've been doing that for like, decades before I started this line of work, right? And so that experience kind of did really work for me in not making me feel so overwhelmed.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, there's a term called harm reduction, or the shelter I worked in was a wet shelter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that means that you can have drugs and alcohol on site. We're not going to stop you from having drugs and alcohol, but there becomes other issues when you have drugs and alcohol on site, which generally is you create certain markets. So whatever markets exist in the streets, violent or not, you just put them inside your facility. That's my critique on that, and I don't know how you stop that, and maybe you have a better solution. But I remember sometime last summer, Tucker Carlson did a little not an expose, but he had a little rant about some of these emergency shelters because they're wet shelters.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trying to convince people that their hard-earned tax dollars were going to buying crack for crack addicts. And that's not how it works. No one comes in with your daily allotment of crack rocks. Like no, that doesn't happen. One thing that we definitely did give people there was one facility that was called, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a quarantine facility. So you had to stay there for 14 days. So it's where I don't know if they're still going there, but it's where the prisoners were going, or the formerly incarcerated people were going, that the prison system had to let go because, the state of California sued the prison system. It was like, you can't release these people that all have COVID because of us back into society. They have to go quarantine. So our facility was one of those facilities. And so these guys got little shot bottles if they had drinking problems.
Mm-hmm.
If you got the shakes or something, you got a shot bottle. And there also was a lot of unhoused people in there. So they got 3 shots a day, which isn't a lot.
No.
And we had a more conservative fellow that was showing this Tucker Carlson clip as kind of trying to show the folly of the state's ways. And it made me mad. And I stopped him and I said, hey, how much do we really spend on alcohol? And he goes, well, I have the figures. I was like, honestly, how much do we spend? And he said $2,000 a month. I was like, that's not a lot of money. Considering you're buying alcohol for multiple facilities, that's not a lot of money. We spend more on water than we spend on alcohol. So you could easily do that piece on how California is hydrating the masses opposed to getting people drunk.
Well, I think there's a difference between, preventing people from, going into, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about drugs, right, is that, due to like a lot of popular media and movies, people always assume that heroin withdrawal is the worst. Mm-hmm. And heroin withdrawal or like opioid withdrawal can be terrible, right? And it can, be medically dangerous if you have pre-existing health conditions, But the most dangerous withdrawal is benzodiazepines and alcohol. Like those can kill you. Mm-hmm. So what you're trying to do is prevent people from dying.
It's a bare minimum too, right?
Right.
There's little.
Because one of the things, like, with, for example, like, a lot of criticisms, needle exchanges,
yes.
Methadone, right? Those tend to get like a similar kind of critique when it comes to, you're just keeping people high, but one of the major things about, needle exchanges is it's a public health measure, right? You don't want people getting hepatitis. You don't want people catching HIV. You don't want people developing heart issues from using dirty needles, abscesses. What you're trying to do is keep people as healthy as possible so that they develop a motivation to, start dealing, productively with this enormous, issue that they're carrying. right? Like a lot of times when you say addict, people have this concept of, I guess, the stigma of like a moral degenerate.
Yes.
When what it is you have somebody that's often, especially with the unhoused, carrying an enormous burden of survival stress, mental distress, emotional distress. This is a person in pain, in unimaginable stress and pain. And
So, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
so it's kind of like so my I was introduced to, so like another kind of like rarity, I guess, in my field is that I come from a harm reduction background. And that started with my interest in AIDS, right? Because a lot of needle exchange programs came from that era. That was the start of that in trying to prevent HIV transmission. So that was kind of like what got me interested in harm reduction. So my introduction to drugs to a certain degree has been harm reduction based, not abstinence based. And also like to a certain degree, like I grew up with an uncle that was, severely alcoholic. And and he lived, like grew up with my grandparents most of the time when I was really little. So like he lived with us, so I grew up with him in my environment. And granted, like my uncle wasn't necessarily a dangerous person. He wasn't necessarily like a severely violent person. But watching him growing up, like because my grandparents on my mom's side that I grew up with were Buddhist pastors, I guess you could say, right? Head of the temple, and my grandmother would go and do all these prayer rounds, and, she would take me with her. And, the prayer rounds, doing the ritual and the prayer was like one aspect of it. But, more or less the most important aspect of doing that for my grandmother was like sitting down and like talking to the people in the village and counseling them and kind of listening to their problems. So to a certain degree, I kind of got a window into like certain basics of counseling through listening for hours on end every day, listening to my grandmother counsel people. And I realized like, oh, like, so all these families, like you have people that like drink functionally, right? And you have people that drink, dysfunctionally. And I realized even at a young age that it wasn't necessarily the alcohol, but that there were other issues that were prompting people to, deal with their problems with alcohol. So I never grew up thinking like, oh, alcohol was the problem. And I never looked at my uncle as like, you're a drunk. I looked at my uncle and I was like, what is making you drink? And I was only 5, 4, 3 at the time. So like, I didn't have the skills to like really sit down, and it's also not a proper place for a child to like sit down and try to counsel their adult, uncles, right? So I never, was able to have a conversation with my uncle about what prompted him to drink, but just kind of like watching his behavior patterns and watching some of the struggles that he went through kind of gave me an idea that like, there was something more than the drinking that was happening with him. Like, hearing from his brother, my other uncle, about like some of the issues that he faced, or some of the behaviors that he had when he was younger. Listening to my mom talk about my uncle, I was just like, oh, okay, like this wasn't just the alcohol. That there was a lot more to what was going on with this person that made him, that caused his behaviors.
So when you look at harm reduction, like, can you just do a brief explanation on what harm reduction is?
So, I will give my personal take on it, and I'm speaking probably for myself and not necessarily, the larger community per se, but like, so there's harm reduction is like, social drug policy, right? Which is things like wet shelters, which is things like needle exchanges, which is things like methadone and medicated assisted treatment. And then, there's kind of harm reduction as it pertains to counseling and in terms of specific drug treatment. And I don't really like the term harm reduction anymore because election politics have kind of taken over that term. So like how I like to kind of explain people about, harm reduction in terms of drug treatment is how I see it as a drug counselor is, for me, harm reduction is a psychology based treatment and not an ideology based treatment. Because a lot of drug treatment is ideology, zero tolerance, abstinence only. Right? That's ideology-based treatment where like you quit everything, you never touch mind-altering substances in your life, right? Versus harm reduction is a process-based treatment. Like if you start thinking about, say, a medical problem, that kind of applies, right? You have somebody that has heart disease or diabetes, right? Those diseases often require huge lifestyle changes to the person in order for them to manage their health condition, right? They have to change their diet. They have to start exercising. And it's not like, people with heart disease and diabetes often succeed right off the bat in being able to change their diet and exercise. Like it's usually a long process, where they start making, small changes that stick over time before they can really succeed, right? I mean, weight loss, for example, not something that like people aren't able to change their diet right away. Like.
So you're saying it's just like a slower process that we kind of don't respect the slowness of the process, right?
Right. And kind of like what you emphasize, right? Like it's not necessarily the ideal outcome based focus, but the small successful changes that people can make over time. So like,
okay, go ahead.
So like, for example, a lot of times, there's a certain stigma in drug treatment to like, if you fall off the wagon, right? And rather than kind of, stigmatizing people not being able to completely adhere to abstinence, it's working with that individual in terms of, hey, like, what did you do right? Right? Like I often counsel people, like, I don't want you to necessarily count consecutive days, but total days, because those are different.
Interesting.
So, for example, if your history was that you were able to abstain from using for 30 days, but, you often fall off the wagon at 30 days, and then it's like 3 months before you're able to kind of like manage to get back and, maintain abstinence again, right? If you fall off the wagon at 30 days, but you come back in 2 weeks instead of 3 months, that's a huge improvement.
Mm-hmm.
I want to encourage that, right? Or like, you fell off the wagon, but you were able to sober up and go back to work and work through your non-abstinence, right? Without getting fired. Right? That if that wasn't something that you were able to manage before, like you've learned something. You've built some skill sets there.
Mm-hmm.
And you're gaining experience in success. nobody succeeds at anything immediately. It's like playing an instrument. You fuck up all the time.
Speak for yourself there, Misty, because you're talking to greatness. No, I'm totally kidding. Totally kidding. So when you hear, well, let me just ask it straight up. When you hear, the defund the police slogan, which I understand what people are asking for, do you think the slogan oversimplifies a more serious issue? Because I think what people are tired of seeing is law enforcement that's armed, responding to situations that they may deem dangerous, that could be some sort of mental health crisis. I can speak for someone that's worked with mental health crises. There's not too many counselors that want to run over and have you talk someone down that might have a weapon on them, male or female. And I'm not saying those people don't exist. I've literally had people tell me, we're not coming. Just go ahead and call the police. We're not coming.
It's a difficult, one of the things that I always say is that, it's, again, it's one of those things where looking at drug policy, we've always kind of had a supply side, supply and demand kind of, solution to everything, right? We don't like something, we ban it. We like something, we legalize it, promote it, and
marijuana, for example.
Right. For example, and it's one of those things where I think society is a lot more complicated than that. So, whatever the slogan is less of an issue. My question is, what is your solution? And does the solution match the depth and the breadth of the issue at hand? And one of the things that I always say is that if you want something to work, you have to fund an alternate and have that fully functional and ready to go before you take something away. So it's one of those things where if we're dealing with, because, it's one of those things where mental health is a very difficult conversation to have in our society. It's severely stigmatized, highly feared, and so it's, and I think a lot of times when people haven't necessarily, worked with the unhoused and familiar with the unhoused, right? Somebody that doesn't necessarily make sense can be frightening to a lot of people unless you're used to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that's it can be very, very frightening for a lot of people when you're not. I remember once there was a guy, I think somebody gave him some bad meth and he kind of tripped out out of nowhere. He was pretty quiet and he started throwing bottles at people, and he threw a bottle at the wrong guy's wife. And I broke up whatever was going to happen, and I'm being instructed, call the police. And as soon as the guy saw security, something clicked in his head, and I think he had just got out of prison. So he put his hands behind his back like he was in a prison yard and just got down to the ground. And even by the time law enforcement got there, they were even kind of weirded out. They're like, man, this guy's really, really scared.
Yeah.
This is something happened to this dude. Right. And if you're a cop on the scene and you come up and see a cat throwing, bottles at people, and you're not, I think that gun, even though you might be scared, it helps you deal with that fear. And when you don't have a weapon, this is me speaking from personal experience. I don't have a gun for this reason. You have to really assess the situation that you're in and figure out if this is something you might need to run from or that you can talk this man down off this ledge. And I just saw something in his eyes where it's like, this dude is shook. He's not trying to fight. He's trying to protect himself.
Yeah.
That's a very different emotion. And it's a different way to deal with that than rage.
And I think, I mean, it's very rare that policemen have a training in like, psychology and social services, and like, a lot of their experience with the unhoused come through their job and not necessarily, learning techniques prior to the job.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of a very difficult thing to ask of people that don't have experience. I mean, I do support, social services responding to these situations. And I think they are better off at handling these situations. But again, like, once they're, talking to this person and getting them calmed down and getting them, to a place where they can be transported and getting help and getting care, it's like, okay, like you send them to the mental hospital, right? They're out and back on the street. And it's, a washing machine.
And that's how I feel about it. It feels like a never-ending revolving door. And when you say words like burnout, it feels to me like the burnout is inevitable, because back to your initial point, if you're really not trying to create real solutions to these societal ills, and if your solution, when people started burning shit down, the powers that be had to listen for a moment for a change to the people. And it's interesting that I feel like it worked to a certain extent, because there's a lot of municipalities that are like, okay, we're going to pull so much money from the police budget. And in Oakland, I think they took cops out of public schools. That's huge.
Yeah.
But again,
I don't know if they hired enough counselors and if there's enough money in programs, to really help these kids.
And that goes back to your initial point, that if you're just doing, okay, you want the cops out, fine. Now are you going to shut up? They're out. But when we see one incident of violence in said school, now we're going to remind you that you wanted this. We're going to play it on the news ad nauseum, and it will be the failure of your movement. And tough on crime will be back quicker than you could, I don't know, a good cute analogy for that. But I think a lot of people forget tough on crime rhetoric was not just bipartisan, but whatever we call a left definitely had a lot of tough on crime rhetoric as well.
Well, the left is a product of society as much as the center and the right in some ways. We have an extraordinarily punitive society.
Yes.
We don't have a society that believes in the ability for people to change.
I agree.
And when you're kind of dealing with that kind of assumptions, which, I would like to say as a counselor is completely false. People have an incredible ability to change. I think it's really important that, and I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional, but I think it's really important that we remember that with people.
That's true. I appreciate I appreciate all that you do. First of all, let me say that. And
I mean, I'll say this, right? I don't know how people are going to change. That's the thing. Not a psychic, right? What I can only do as a person is give them all the benefit of the doubt, give them all the tools and knowledge that to be able to make that happen for people as much as I can. You know, like a lot of times, you know, because that's one of the things, right? Like a lot of times there's, you know, when you live in a punitive society, compliance gets a lot more gravitas than it should. But a lot of times I actually worry about the clients that don't fight back, that are compliant, that do what you tell them to, because a lot of times they're just skating under the radar. You know, it like, you know, as a counselor, like, you know, a lot of times when a client's like, fuck you, I'm like, yeah, you got spirit. I can use this. Right? Because to a certain degree, you know, once you've been beaten down so much, it's really hard to kind of get people out of that, you know, sense of deep, deep helplessness and passivity. You know, the people that are still like, you know, still have that, you know, fuck you, you know, like, it's like, okay, you still got some fighting spirit. I can reroute that to good use. You know, and that's kind of like where sometimes, you know, compliance can kind of, or like, you know, an emphasis on compliance can kind of screw you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because a lot of times it's, you know, it's one of those things where, like, you know, when people ask me, like, oh, do you know who's going to succeed when they come into treatment? I might have some inkling, right, of like, you know, because you look at their history, you know, and you know, because like the intake packet at these facilities are like, you know, a fucking encyclopedia, right, of like all these forms that they have to, you know, and like, you know,
Yeah.
and abuse, like, yeah, I mean, all these questions, you know, and you look through that, you know, and you can tell like somebody that has, you know, just on paper, like an incredible amount of issues versus someone that may have, you know, less. You know, but I don't know how you're going to succeed. And also, like, my metric of success isn't necessarily your metric of success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, I at the end of the day, I don't, you know, these people are strangers. I don't know you. I have to get to know you before I can make any assessments. You know, and even then, that's a constant process. You know, like, people change in really unexpected ways.
Yes. Sometimes for the good.
Oh, yeah. I mean, many times for the good, I would like to say.
Well, we've been talking for about an hour. Did it fly by for you?
Oh, God, I didn't know that already an hour has passed.
Well, don't hang up. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Will you come back?
Yes.
Will you stick around for the bonus half?
Yes.
Okay, so you heard it. If you want to hear more of this conversation, become a patron. You get to hear all of the bonus content from these really fun one-on-one interviews, and there's also some bonus video stuff I've been posting up. lately for patrons from stuff that got pulled down from YouTube. So thank you very much. The one that shall not be named. And we'll get into the juicy bits. So, yeah. So if you want to hear more of this conversation, become a patron. There's links in the description. Wherever you're listening to this show, there's links in the description. Thank you very much. Akira, don't hang up. We are out.